At the outset of World War II, the British sent an expeditionary force into Belgium to help the French push back the invading German armies. But Germany was too strong. With hundreds of thousands of English troops surrounded at the town of Dunkirk, a massive evacuation was planned. It was an impossible task, but amidst the tragedy of loss, there was also the miracle at Dunkirk. This is where the British took their first major stand against the Germans, on the battlefront. On September 1st, 1939, 112 divisions of the German army roll into Poland. By May 1940, Hitler orders the implementation of Plan Yellow for the invasion of Holland, Belgium, and France. "136 divisions are committed to bring the French to their knees." Adolf Hitler then plans to cross the Channel to England. He is confident he can defeat the armies of the Low Countries. But a British expeditionary force of 250,000 men has been sent to defend France and can pose stiff opposition.
The British Expeditionary Force was, in contemporary parlance, a strike force. It was the sum total of the forces Britain could put into the field in Europe. It moved from Britain to France soon after the declaration of war in September 1939, and by May 1940, it was actually the most powerful army on the Allied side.
The German plan is a two-pronged attack to seal off the French First Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and the Belgian Army.
Well, the Germans had been riding high. Everything had gone their way. They were convinced that the war would be over quickly, that they were going to defeat the British, and that the war would be over and they'd be home by fall. Everything had gone so well in the spring of 1944 that they had very few casualties, and they were completely high on the glory of winning. The Dutch, being a very small nation with no sizable military force, the Belgians the same way, there was no chance that the Germans would be stopped by the Dutch or the Belgians.
The Germans handily defeat the Belgian army with military superiority and strength.
When the Germans opened the offensive in the West, the British Expeditionary Force moved into Belgium as part of what was called the Dial Plan. They were expecting that the major German move would come through Belgium, past Brussels, the way it had in 1914. Civilians were glad to see them, showed they were not alone, but there were already disconcerting signs. There were crowds of refugees already taking shape on the road, Belgians fleeing German air attacks.
With their light, movable army, the British take up positions quickly.
As the British moved into Belgium, was some days before they met the German army. What they did encounter was first the German Air Force. There were initial attacks on British positions.
On May 14th, 4 days after the invasion, General Erwin Rommel orders his 7th Panzer Division, known as the Ghost Division, across the Meuse River.
This was the spearhead of the German advance towards Dunkirk. It was called the Ghost Division because it moved so fast the French High Command could not keep track of its location.
Only 1 day later, German troops marched victoriously into Holland. Rommel is now convinced the way to the west is open.
The British morale endured despite the repeated defeats of the French army. This was a strong force, a lot of pre-war regulars, and had a great deal of confidence in itself and its leaders.
Because of the weakness of the other armies, the British forces begin to fall back toward the coastal towns. The Germans have been able to break through French defenses and create a dangerous 50-mile gap in the lines. The Germans are on their way to yet another conquest.
Obviously, they felt extremely confident. There was nothing to hold them. There was no opposition virtually to their movements. And at that time, of course, the Luftwaffe still could provide air cover, so that the Germans were extremely optimistic and convinced that the war was going to be over. They were going to win it easily.
Just 10 days after the invasion, the Germans have pushed all opposition to the sea.
They had defeated whatever resistance there was. They had destroyed the French resistance in a very short time. The British were running. There was no reason for them not to be ecstatic.
But the soldiers of both the retreating and advancing armies are not the only ones on the move.
Germans had opened their offensive in the west with massive air attacks, creating loads of refugees, which impeded British and French troop movement. In some places, the people had had their houses destroyed in the First World War and were just horrified that it was all going to happen again. Most of the British army retreated on Dunkirk in good order and was intended to have won many of the battles they encountered with the German army as they retreated.
With the British surrounded at Boulogne and Calais, Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal von Rundstedt orders his panzers to a halt because of the loss of too many tanks in the advance. After 2 weeks of hard battle, German soldiers take advantage of the time off to tend to personal luxuries and some frivolity. But it all ends too soon. As the countryside becomes a battleground, civilians continue their flight. With the Germans closing in from both east and west, and with the ocean behind them, the British consider a last resort: a full evacuation from Dunkirk.
Some individuals cut off from their units came back and were helped out by French civilians. Many made their way to Dunkirk if they had been cut off during the retreat in disguise. By and large, the British Expeditionary Force fell back towards Dunkirk in good order.
When the Germans learn of the evacuation plan, von Rundstedt orders his panzers back into battle and launches the biggest attack of the campaign. But the respite has allowed the Allies the opportunity to mount a ring of artillery around the besieged army. The Germans can no longer break through easily. With all the British troops moving towards Dunkirk, the question remains, how will 340,000 of them be evacuated? May 27th, 1940. With the Germans closing in from both sides, the bulk of the British force and part of the French First Army escapes through the middle of the enemy divisions into the area around Dunkirk.
Fortunately for the British, the terrain around Dunkirk is very good for defense. There are canals which they could set up defensive positions behind and prove formidable obstacles to German tanks.
The only weapons the British have at Dunkirk are small arms and World War I vintage machine guns. There's a noticeable shortage of any heavy artillery.
One of the great losses were once they got to Dunkirk, all the vehicles, artillery pieces had to be destroyed. Many of the trucks were driven into the English Channel, using to build up makeshift docks to bring boats alongside when the evacuation started.
While a delaying action is waged in the south at the port of Calais to prevent the Germans from driving up the coast, the battle to hold Dunkirk rages furiously. The fight moves from street to street and house to house. The battle for Dunkirk has been reduced to the bare minimum. There are no large armies facing each other, just small groups of desperate, trapped men. May 28th, with German tanks within sight of Dunkirk, von Rundstedt orders his panzers out for good and heads them south to Paris.
The German commanders were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe that they had been told to halt. They felt that they could have wiped out the British Army right there. We now know that Hitler probably didn't want to destroy the British Army at that point because he still, in 1940, had visions of a German-English alliance against Russia.
But there are still nearly 350,000 men at Dunkirk to be evacuated. The rescue plan, called Operation Dynamo, has many obstacles. English ships must face minefields, German U-boats, and Luftwaffe fighters as they cross the Channel. If they make it through, there are still the enemy guns at Calais. Once within reach of Dunkirk, the big ships discover they are too big for the port's shallow waters. They can't get in close enough to evacuate the men. Only 7,000 make it out the first day in rescue boats, just 2%. On the 29th, the ships use a new coastal approach to Dunkirk. They escape the Calais shelling, but instead, they're bombed and strafed by the Luftwaffe. "47,000 troops now make it out safely. By late afternoon on the 29th, all rescue teams are alerted. Dunkirk Harbor is now blocked by damaged ships. Any further evacuations must be conducted from the beaches. In this one day alone, 3 destroyers have been sunk, 6 badly damaged. The Admiralty, alarmed by the loss, suddenly orders all new class destroyers withdrawn. Without them, the evacuation is in trouble. Although the Panzer divisions have withdrawn, units of German soldiers continue to harass the town of Dunkirk. On the morning of May 30th, an urgent telephone call goes to the British War Ministry. Commanders report that the perimeter defense cannot be held for long. They need as many boats and as much ammunition as possible. All of the British Expeditionary Force and the remnants of the French First Army have now congregated onto a corner of beach 24 miles long and 6 miles wide. From across the Channel, the strangest fleet in naval history begins to materialize. From the luxury yachts of the wealthy to the grimy working tugs of London, anything that can float is brought into service. The captains of these small boats have heard the thunder of artillery from across the Channel in England, but neither the fear of the big guns nor the omens of disaster could hold them back. It is an all-out English effort. Naval records show that many yachts, although warned that they are too slow, start out against orders and have to be turned back by the Navy. A total of 861 ships and private craft take part in the operation, braving a fierce bombardment by the Luftwaffe. In the air encounters, which take place over the Channel, the Germans lose 130 aircraft, and the RAF 106, with 87 British pilots dead or captured.
By moving over 250,000 troops of all nationalities, their close proximity from the Germans, certainly at great cost to both the Navy and the Royal Air Force, was a tremendous feat. The fact that they were assisted by mobilized civilian craft, the legend of the little ships at Dunkirk, which civilians brought boats out, across the Channel to ferry troops from the beaches to warships and transports offshore. This was all part to show the British that the war was a real thing.
With Frenchmen also thronging the beaches, Churchill orders them given an equal opportunity for evacuation. By the 31st of May, 200,000 men have been freed. June 1st, in a last-ditch effort to stop the evacuation, the Germans go all out and throw everything they have at Dunkirk. By the end of the day, 31 ships have been sunk, 11 badly damaged. The Germans are within 4 miles of the beach. But still, the ships come, because there are men yet to be saved. The injured take priority on the ships. Everyone else is crammed onto any part of the boat, except the bridge and the engine room. Some of the men are lucky enough to be fed. For the others, leaving Dunkirk and certain disaster is reward enough. At 11:30 p.m., June 2nd, Dunkirk signals British Expeditionary Force evacuated. At 9 a.m. on the morning of June 3rd, 40,000 remaining troops, mostly French, surrender. The Germans also capture large amounts of abandoned British and French equipment. 2,472 guns, 84,427 vehicles, and 657,000 tons of ammunition and stores.
The evacuation of Dunkirk was one of the great heroic episodes of the Second World War, one of many evacuations. In fact, the British saw this as so much of a success that Churchill had to go on the radio and remind people that wars are not won by evacuations.
Everyone is relieved that from the ruins of Dunkirk, 338,000 men are saved by daring boat owners and are free to fight again. For the people of England, the siege of Dunkirk is at an end. But for the French, the Battle of France is about to begin. In early 1940, Norway, with its strategic location and access to important natural resources, became a prized target of both the German and British navies. Both countries would fight to be the victor. Rudi Tepfer was aboard a German destroyer. It was here where he met the enemy, on the battlefront. By late 1939, Hitler's tank forces have overtaken Poland and are headed for France. But to keep the German war machine going, natural resources must be constantly available. One of these necessities is iron ore. Nestled along the coast of Norway are ports through which such resources can be shipped to Germany, unless the British get there first. In early 1940, Norway, up to now a neutral country, becomes a strategic location for both Germany and England. After a British destroyer attacks a German Predator ship in neutral waters and frees 300 English prisoners, Hitler realizes he must take Norway quickly. He schedules an invasion for April 9th. The German plan is to simultaneously occupy ports along a 1,000-mile stretch of Norwegian coastline. Oslo in the south, Trondheim in the middle, and Narvik in the north. It'll be the first combined land, sea, and air operation in history.
Norway was important to the British for several reasons. First, Germany drew much of its iron ore, much of the surplus iron ore it depended on for war making, from Sweden. Secondly, and arguably even more important, the British hoped to frustrate the German youth of the Norwegian coastline, to send out surface raiders and naval squadrons.
In late March, Britain starts secret preparations to lay mines in neutral Norwegian waters to cut the German supply line. Also, an occupying force is made ready to invade strategic Norwegian ports. At the same time, from northern German seaports, troops begin to depart. On board a German ship headed for Norway is 21-year-old Lieutenant Rudi Tepfer.
On the 6th of April 1940, 10 of our destroyers assembled in Bremerhaven when nobody knew what was going on. Our destroyers had a crew of 350 Navy personnel. And in addition to that, we got more than 200 mountaineers from a mountain division from Austria. Our first thing was to occupy Norway because England wanted to do that. We knew that by our intelligence because they were afraid that our submarines could come out of the German Bay into the Atlantic. In 2.5 days, by very stormy weather, we drove high speed up to northern Norway, north of the polar circle, to Narvik.
The British government, even again before the Germans attacked, was putting pressure on Norway to adopt a more favorable stance towards Great Britain.
But when the British receive reports of a large German fleet moving toward Norway, the Admiralty issues an order to seek out the German ships and engage them in battle. The German ability to decode messages of British naval movements enable them to avoid their pursuers. Every effort to stop the German invasion fails. Along the fjord leading to Oslo, outdated Norwegian strongholds are easily neutralized by German naval and air bombardment. At Oslo, the main airfield is taken without resistance. By noon on April 8th, 1,500 German troops march victoriously through the streets of Norway's capital. At historic Trondheim, 2 old forts protecting the entrance to the harbor are quickly taken. German troops now have control of this city as well. In the early morning on April 9th, 2 German destroyer flotillas enter the Vestafjord approach to Narvik. 2 Norwegian ships are ordered to surrender. They are unwilling to give in. The German response comes in the form of a fierce shelling.
We occupied the harbor and released our mountaineers so that they could get any Norwegian resistance. But the Norwegian didn't really resist because they were not sure were we the English or were we the Germans. And so they were hesitant, and we had an easy way to occupy Narvik and all the military outposts in the environment. There was no bloodshed and no casualty at all.
In just one day, the Germans have accomplished all their military objectives. Whatever Norwegian resistance there is sabotaged by collaborators. Communications between units are disrupted, and all countermeasures against the invading Germans fail. Former Defense Minister Vidkun Quisling has made a secret pact with the Germans to allow them easy entry. From this time on, the name Quisling becomes synonymous with traitor. April 11th, 2 days after the German occupation of Norway, a British invasion force belatedly sets out to sea.
The British plans are really almost entirely improvised. Units are taken from everywhere. Troops are frequently not told where they're going. Even their company and regimental commanders do not know exactly where they're going. Many ships are poorly loaded, so that the things you need most, like radios, would be at the bottom of the hold, and material you need less would be more accessible. When the British respond, they put force structures together like you glue toothpicks to make a sculpture, and with no more intrinsic strength. The ships they use are the ones that are available at the time. And the Royal Navy at this stage is very badly overstretched. When you talk about British strategy in Norway, about the only thing they could think of to do was stop the Germans wherever they were. The British, in other words, were reacting to the German initiatives, and the Germans were on the ground and able to move faster.
April 13th, 1940, a British strike force heads into the German-held Norwegian port of Narvik for the first major face-off of the war. April 13th, 1940, a powerful British task force makes its final approach to Narvik.
The English came with destroyers because they had all their forces outside prepared for that occupation of northern Norway. Most of our destroyers were in the harbor. Some of them were not. My destroyer was not there either. And the English fired blindly into the harbor, sinking 3 of our destroyers and sunk them. And they also sunk 14 merchant ships of different nationalities. We in the fjord, which we are about an hour away from it, heard that gunfire in the morning. We speeded in the direction of that gunfire and fell the English in the flank. And they were surprised because they didn't expect us. Then the next day, the English came with aircraft carrier and a battleship, several cruisers, and they finished us up because the cruiser gun, they could reach us. They kept out of reach from our smaller destroyer guns. So we were sunk about a mile out of the shoreline. When the order came from the skipper to abandon ship, we jumped into the water. I swam to one of the rafts, but that was overcrowded. Was later on immediately caught by the English, taken prisoners, and I tried to reach the shore.
The British counterattack at Narvik is, in narrow tactical terms, a great success. They sink almost half of the German Navy's destroyers at the loss of only 3 of their own, but the problem is the Germans are still holding Narvik. When British troops began landing at various points of the Norwegian coast, the main impression offered to the soldiers and the junior officers was one of confusion. On the whole, the British were lacking transport, they were lacking winter clothes, they were lacking the kind of foodstuffs you need to keep going in Arctic areas and in rough country. And from the various ports, these British units are sent forward with about the only mission being find the Germans, fight them, and defeat them. The average British column had almost no ability to maneuver in Norway's mountains.
The Germans rush reinforcements into southern Norway. Meanwhile, British troops land unopposed in the central part of the country. On April 18th, a German division leaves from Oslo, heading north to join up with forces holding Trondheim.
the mountaineers were all scattered around, and they formed a defense line to prevent the English from capturing Narvik. And they did a marvelous job. We knew that we had only to do that for 2-3 days, we thought, because the German army came through all of Norway to Narvik. And it was said that they would be there in 3 days, maybe 4 days. But it took them 2 weeks because there are no roads up there. And even up there where we were, there was not a road.
While the German army is penetrating more deeply into Norway, the traitor Quisling is removed from his governmental position and replaced. The new governing council immediately declares war on Germany. There are Norwegian troops resisting the Germans, but outnumbered and outgunned, they are unable to halt the enemy advance.
Within a predictable period of time, German attack planes and light bombers would be bombing and strafing roads, and it was very difficult to get off the road. There was nowhere to run to in this mountainous coastal area. So you develop a situation in which just about everybody has a stiff neck from looking skyward and looking to the rear.
Within 5 days, Germans have joined their 2 invading armies in Oslo and Trondheim. All of central and southern Norway is now under German control. The Germans flex their military might and take British prisoners of war.
I was captured at Varberg by the Germans. From there I came to Littlehammer. And we had a supper, consisted of brown bread, gorgonzola, wine, which the Germans gave to us, cigarettes, and a hot meal each day. And getting on fairly decent. And I hope the war will soon be over and we'll all be going back home.
It's a long, long way to Tipperary.
On May 27th, an Allied force moves by sea for a direct assault on Narvik.
As the campaign progresses, the British are primarily concerned with reconquering and holding Narvik and preventing a complete German victory. As the central sector falls more and more under German control, Narvik is seen by the British and French as the key to their successful completion of the campaign.
To take Narvik from the rear is impossible because of the mountains. We don't even bother to put up a defense line from that direction. Our mountaineers always choose a higher positions, so they will be above when the enemy approaches. The whole population has left Narvik because of the British shelling the town. They all went to their ski huts in the mountains. They know we won't give up easily. Whatever the English want, they will have to get by fighting their way through.
British put together an expeditionary corps, and the main thing they have to get are landing craft. The attack on Narvik is the first time that the British use modern landing craft, because the British understand that, and the French understand as well, but it's going to have to be an opposed landing. And you can't do this in an improvised fashion.
The Germans in the hills around Narvik are commanded by a mountain troops officer who uses the rugged terrain for cover. He doesn't want to give the British Navy any targets. But the British will not continue to hold Narvik. With Allied armies retreating from the Germans in France, orders are issued for an immediate withdrawal from Norway.
Within a few days, it becomes obvious that Narvik is now a sideshow of a sideshow, and it is pointless to continue the campaign. So the French and British withdraw, and the ordinary British expressing themselves in words more colorful than polite. Many of his superior officers aren't very happy as well with this either.
The Luftwaffe renews its air attacks as the troops are loaded aboard ships.
Germans, well, their destroyers are all gone, and their air transports are overstretched. And the German general pulls out a large handkerchief, mops his brow, and offers thanks.
Only one Allied objective remains in Norway, the destruction of Narvik's port facilities. Over a period of 5 days, the Allied evacuation is completed. By June 8th, all 25,000 French and British troops are aboard transports and on their way to England.
British morale was at rock bottom. In some ways, the Norway morale was even worse than those who come out of Dunkirk, because the Narvik Expeditionary Force said we were pulled away from a victory that was ours.
Rudi Tepfer stays in Norway with the occupying force before returning to Germany and being reassigned to U-boat duty. Although the Germans can bask in the glory of their victory, it is not without losses.
Each of our destroyers had a crew of a little bit more than 300 sailors each. And of these, only half of them made it after the second battle in Norway. The others died.
2 days after the evacuation, Norway surrenders. It is a fortuitous but decisive German victory. After Hitler pushed through Europe and into France, his next conquest, England, stood up to him in defiance. Only 90 miles from the French coast, the British Isles were in danger of invasion from the sea and bombardment from the air. It was in the air war that English pilots of the RAF distinguished themselves and would forever be credited with winning the Battle of Britain. George Unwin was a Spitfire pilot in the Royal Air Force. This is where he would meet the enemy, in the skies over war-torn Britain, on the battlefront. In the fall of 1940, Hitler turns his blitzkrieg on Western Europe. His targets are Holland, Belgium, and France. The German war machine easily scores one victory after another. "338,000 British troops are pushed back to the coast of France at Dunkirk and saved only by a massive armada of English ships. Now poised at the Channel, Hitler tries to talk the English into surrender. When they resist, he orders his chiefs of staff to begin work on a secret plan for the invasion of England. The code name is Operation Sea Lion. Before the Germans can cross the Channel, they must eliminate the only remaining British defense, the Royal Air Force. German Air Minister Reich Marshal Hermann Göring is given the responsibility for the air battles that will cripple England. Hitler plans to force British fighter pilots into the air so the Luftwaffe can drastically reduce their numbers, paving the way for any big offensive in the future. By July, 1,500 German bombers and over 1,000 fighters are concentrated within easy flying distance of the United Kingdom. They wreak havoc on English shipping in the Channel. With the German forces about to strike England, the situation looks hopeless. Their first line of defense are the Hurricanes and Spitfires. One of the young RAF flyers piloting a Spitfire is George Unwin.
The thing about the Spitfire that was so useful in combat was its maneuverability. One of the things that frightens pilots to death is a spin. The Messerschmitt, the German fighter, was particularly bad on high-speed stall. And so we could turn inside any of the German fighters, and that was the one thing that saved us time and time again. Invariably in a fight, you're chasing each other round and round and round, but you could turn much more tight, smaller turning circle than any German fighter. The aircraft was perfect in every possible way.
Aircraft production is operating at maximum capacity, but the RAF still only has 620 planes. British flyers are outnumbered by at least 2 to 1 by their German counterparts. England's defenses are increased by a chain of radar stations around the coast. But in other ways as well, Britain is prepared for the inevitable conflict. The people of London evacuate children to the country and strengthen anti-aircraft defenses. Faced with air attacks and a possible invasion, the British remain undaunted under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who rejects German suggestions of a British surrender.
I was one of the lucky boys. I'd been flying for 4 years when the war started. I had 600 hours flying on fighters. You can't count in any other way the advantage that gave to me. We had the experience and the ability to fly. Flying is experience. The more you fly, the better you get. But the Germans were pretty good too.
Well, the Luftwaffe had been built carefully over a period of years. So they had experienced pilots, combat pilots who had flown in Poland, who had flown earlier in the year in France and Holland. So the Luftwaffe had a high level of competence, high level of training and experience. Also, the morale of the Luftwaffe was very high. They had found nothing that could compete with them. And they felt that they could beat any Air Force. And they had the numbers, the experience, and the morale.
By the end of July, the English managed to dominate the skies, but they have been forced to cancel all ships sailing through the Channel during daylight.
The German bombers were nearly always escorted by fighters. And the Spitfire, with its greater speed and maneuverability, was eventually it was decided that they should take on the fighters, leaving the Hurricanes free to attack the bombers, because the Hurricane firepower was so concentrated he could shoot down the bombers as fast as they could put them up, providing they were not interfered with. And so our orders were to take on the escort, keep the escort away from the Hurricanes, who would then do the necessary and shoot down the bombers as far as possible. I know the German pilots had fought a war in Spain, and the experienced ones, but they weren't all experienced. And as the fight went on, it was becoming obvious that their replacements were nowhere near as good as their predecessors. The Germans always flew in pairs, you see. We flew stupidly in threes for a while, until we tumbled to it. But in pairs, you collared onto a German, got behind him. It was 10 to 1, the other German was behind you.
One of the things that the Luftwaffe really miscalculated was the effectiveness of the British defenses. The British had radar, which helped them enormously. And also, the British had so many airfields that were sprung up all over Britain, they could scramble fighter planes quickly. And the British fighters, the Spitfires, proved to be superior to anything the Germans had.
By August, Göring estimates that he needs only 4 days to put the English fighter planes out of action. He begins preparations for Adler Tag, or the Eagle attack, an operation which will be the knockout blow to the RAF. It is decided that the attack will commence on August 13th. For the first time in history, a great campaign is going to be fought and decided in the air.
Well, if you were a bomber pilot, you'd be awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning because all the raids would be conducted at dawn. You'd have breakfast, you'd have your briefing, and at 5:30 or 6 before dawn, you would take off so that the flight over England would come at a time when the sun was rising behind you. And there was a reason for that also. If you were flying from Germany to England, you'd be flying out of the rising sun, which would make it more difficult to see the bombers. And then you'd try to drop the bombs and make the run for home. On the run home, you were completely in daylight. And the Spitfires were able to shoot down large numbers of German planes and pilots. The Germans had the long flight from Germany to Britain and back again, and the odds were with the defenders because they had better planes and they didn't have to fly as far.
From morning until evening, the Luftwaffe carries out a relentless attack. In spite of the bad weather and heavy opposition, they manage to hit airfields, dockyards, and aircraft factories. But in the process, they lose 45 of their aircraft. The British lose only 13.
Killing people, that didn't come into it. We weren't trying to kill people, we were trying to shoot the aircraft down, stop it coming, stop it hitting other people. The bloke sitting in the airplane, we never thought of. I didn't anyway, and I don't think many people did.
2 days later, on August 15th, Göring again puts his squadrons in the air. He hopes that the heavy fighting of the 13th has so severely depleted the RAF that gaps will be left in their defenses. It is to be a day of hard fighting.
German strategy was to bomb England into submission. To do that, they fought with fighters protecting the bombers to fly over Britain. Unescorted bombers could still get away with flying over the Channel and over Britain because they were armed with machine guns. They had 3 guns on each bomber, and they had turrets in which they could shoot 360 degrees.
On this day, the Luftwaffe has gotten nearly 1,800 flights in the air. They had expected an all-out victory. Instead, Adler Tag is a failure. It is the first decisive defeat that the German Air Force has suffered in the war. Because of the heavy casualties, especially among the bomber crews, the German high command is shaken. After a brief lull due to bad weather, the Luftwaffe again attacks with renewed vigor. For the British, the situation is becoming more serious. They are still shooting down more enemy planes than they themselves are losing. But they have now come to a point where the loss of a single plane or the death or wounding of even one pilot represents an important setback. The Germans continue to hammer away at the nerve centers of the Royal Air Force Command. The repair and maintenance squadrons do their best with the overused aircraft, but it's the loss in pilots that is most damaging. Fighter command strength had stood at 1,400 pilots at the end of July. 3 weeks later, it has fallen to 1,000. The pilot forces are being dangerously diminished. The communication systems and airfields are being battered. Even the pilot reserves are reaching desperate lows. Now the question is, how much longer can fighter command hold out? How much longer before the Luftwaffe deals its final crushing blow? How many more days can the English withstand the onslaught? Anxious to put an end to the British standoff, the Germans choose a course of action that will strengthen England's resolve. On August 24th, 200 German bombers are sent to attack targets in many different areas of England and Wales. The pilots do not have specific orders to bomb London, but bombs are dropped on the city. The Germans later deny that the bombing is intentional and place the blame on faulty navigation and mixed messages.
Bombing of London certainly must have been planned. Given the German planning and the devotion to detail and following orders, it's almost inconceivable that the bombing of London could have been accidental, especially given the fact that the Germans targeted the east end of London particularly because they were trying to bomb an area in which they knew that there were a lot of Jews in London living.
The British immediately send their bombers on a retaliatory raid against Berlin. The effect of this raid on Hitler is out of all proportion to the damage done.
Hitler was absolutely flabbergasted. He had promised the German people that no bombs would ever fall on Berlin. And when the British did begin to bomb Berlin, Hitler went almost insane, swearing revenge, swearing he would bomb whole cities off the map. But the Allies had so many planes, there really wasn't by that time anything he could do.
The Luftwaffe is now ordered to switch the offensive from the RAF to the city of London. Hitler believes that a prolonged bombing of London will cause panic and mass hysteria among the population. But the side effect is that the airfields and sector stations are spared at a crucial moment. The RAF is given time to repair the damage done to their facilities and equipment. It also takes the pressure off their fighter pilots. One more week of attacks might have led to disaster. Now the RAF can reconsolidate its forces. Late in the afternoon of Saturday, September 7th, the Germans launch their new strategy. From a forward airbase, Goering himself watches the flights take off toward the English coast. The attack is planned to coincide with factory closings when the most civilians will be exposed. Tons of high explosives and many thousands of incendiary bombs are dropped on London within an hour and a half. The docks and warehouses and the densely packed residential areas which surround them burn furiously. The blaze is visible for miles. The fire started in this raid cannot be put out before more bombers return later that night with another load. All of London seems to be burning. Between 5 o'clock in the evening of September 7th and 3 o'clock the following morning, German bombs kill 1,000 Londoners. Hermann Goering announces proudly on German radio that the Germans have reached an historic hour. The Luftwaffe has delivered its thrust right into the enemy's heart. The next day brings extreme tension and many rumors to London. Some believe that the firestorm is just a prelude to a German invasion. However, the first requirement for a successful invasion has not yet been met. The English Fighter Command is still operating. Hitler decides to await the outcome of the next few days. The British Air Force meets the enemy head-on. The result, fewer than half the German planes succeed in dropping their bombs. Hitler is still hoping that the British will crumble under the repeated attacks on their capital, again postpones his decision to invade. He has been assured that air supremacy is almost within his grasp. The Luftwaffe is now facing a crisis. They must claim victory without any more delay. Goring picks Sunday, September 15th, as the day of reckoning. The morning of September 15th turns out to be ideal flying weather, cloudless and with fine visibility. At about 10:30 a.m., the radar warning system picks up enemy planes gathering over the French coast.
I knew there were a hell of a lot of raids coming in. So I'm at 25,000 feet, so I started looking for some trade, as we used to call it. And I saw this huge armada of bombers coming in, forgetting all about their escort fighters. And I flew straight into the middle of the escort fighters on my own. And I was surrounded with it, whizzing all over the place. So I just simply put the Spitfire into a really tight turn. And every time one of these flashed past me, I pressed the button. But I got away with it and actually shot one down, I think. Its psychological effect upon the German fighters and bombers was incredible. Their morale was down to start with because they were losing every fight they got into. And they were being told that one more big push and it's all over. And they believe this and they come over and they suddenly see 60 fighters, not just a squad. And they've been told we've got none left at all. So the effect on their morale must have been enormous. And the younger pilots, who we found out were far, far inferior to the ones we'd been up against, say, at Dunkirk, they were no match for us at all.
The great battle, which rages all day, was to have crushed Fighter Command. It is instead a shattering blow to the German airmen. The Luftwaffe has been routed. Again, Hitler's gamble has lost. Goering still insists that 4 or 5 more days of heavy fighting will swing the balance. But as far as the invasion is concerned, time has run out.
The tactical result of the German defeat in the Battle of Britain was that Hitler had to give up on the idea of invading England because he could not get air superiority over the Channel.
But Hitler has decided on a new phase of the battle. The German Luftwaffe now sets out with vengeance to destroy London. Night after night, until well into November, London is bombed unmercifully. If the Germans have failed in their destruction of British air power, they intend to succeed in their efforts to break the spirit of Londoners. After 57 days of consecutive bombardment, Londoners prove that they can take it. It is a time when the British, and particularly Londoners, are seen at their best. By November, the night raids are expanded to include the industrial cities of Britain. Coventry is viciously attacked on November 14th, as are Bristol, Southampton, and Liverpool. Plymouth, Sheffield, Manchester, Leeds, and Glasgow also become targets for the bombers. firebombing of England would continue through November of 1941, and 25,000 civilian lives would be lost, but it would not break the English spirit. Some German pilots shot down in the air battles make it back to France and then see their homeland from the inside of a hospital. Those who recover are sent back into service. George Unwin would continue to fly with the RAF and be credited with shooting down 14 enemy planes. He would always be grateful for his aircraft.
If we hadn't had the Spitfire during 1940, then things would have been very, very bad. We would have lost the air battle, and we would have lost the war.
During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe lose over 2,300 aircraft. The British lose 600 fighters. But if there's any single decisive day in the Battle of Britain, it's September 15th, when the RAF bravely faces a very formidable enemy and wins. As Italy entered the war in June of 1941, its first target became the British-held island of Malta. This tiny rock in the Mediterranean was the most bombed country of World War II. But the Maltese were not going to give in, nor were the British. Tony Spooner was an RAF pilot on Malta. This is where he met the enemy, on the battlefront. As 1940 begins, Italy's fascist leader Benito Mussolini is incensed because the British control the nearby island of Malta. This outpost is over 1,000 miles from the nearest British bases at Gibraltar in the west and Alexandria in the east, but it is only 50 miles from Sicily. Malta gives England control of the Mediterranean, and in 1940, the British are at war with Italy's ally, the Germans. On June 11th, one day after Italy enters the war, Mussolini unleashes his bombers on Malta. One RAF pilot who is stationed in Malta is Tony Spooner.
I was there for, I think it was about 1,250 air raids. Not everyone was a serious air raid. Many of them were just reconnaissance flights. But we were bombed on average about 3 or 4 times every day. The Italians used rather antiquated aircraft, and they weren't particularly well protected by armor, and they tended to turn tail at the first sign of any opposition. I was in Coastal Command, and our job in Malta was to go out at night and find the ships which were trying to transport supplies from Italy and Sicily to Rommel's forces in North Africa. And having found them, our job then was to home other people to come and attack them, and occasionally attack them ourselves. Well, the population took it very well, bearing in mind it wasn't even their war. As far as possible, the routine went on. It was business as usual to the extent that you could do business as usual. The bars kept open as long as they possibly could, but of course we eventually ran out of beer and everything else nearly. But it was pretty grim food. It was all tin food or whatever they could find.
While the Maltese go about their daily business, they learn to live with the constant air raids from the ineffective and ill-equipped Italian Air Force.
You get used to it like everything else. It's pretty frightening at first, but then you see other people are paying no attention to it, and in the end you start paying no attention to it.
The Maltese show no signs of giving in, and British anti-aircraft fire wears down Mussolini's pilots.
The Italian aerial bombardment of Malta is a failure, partly because the planes themselves have small bomb loads, and partly because the Italian bombs aren't very good. Partly, the Italian bombers have trouble hitting their target in the face of an anti-aircraft defense, which, while in its initial stage is not all that formidable, is still more flock than the Italians have ever faced before.
British submarines and seaplanes emerge around Malta and constantly torpedo Axis supply vessels on their way to North Africa. This activity is becoming a thorn in the side of the Germans and an embarrassment to the Italians. In January 1941, Hitler sends an entire German air fleet, which has been called back from the Russian front and moved to Sicily. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring is given control of 2,000 top-rate aircraft. Kesselring's mission is to gain control of the air and sea between South Italy and North Africa.
Each adversary had a slightly different reason for wanting this particular piece of rock. As the attacks go on, Malta becomes a symbol for both sides. It's been called the Mediterranean Verdun. The struggle for Malta took on an importance that had nothing to do with the actual utility of the island. In many ways, the German air forces that go after Malta are at the peak of their effectiveness. They've been operating in Europe and in the Mediterranean since the beginning of the war. The crews are well trained, very experienced, and jumping high morale. And this is particularly true of the bomber wings, who have had it mostly their own way since coming to the Mediterranean. They faced very little effective fighter opposition from the British. And so they are confident in their ability to soften up Malta, not least because they see this as a good way of showing up the Italians. There's a swagger in the Luftwaffe's approach here. Again, the crews aren't specially trained, but they've received ordinary Luftwaffe training, by and large, which is very, very good.
Until the Germans came along, we weren't the smallest bit frightened of the Italians. The Germans had dive bombers, and they were far more determined. And it was a different story altogether. And they achieved complete air superiority over the island at one time. To their credit, they really bombed targets, although, of course, when chased by fighters, they often jettisoned their bombs on other places. And so the bombing was concentrated upon 4 areas. One was the port area and the 3 airfields. So everything adjacent to the port, which was a highly populated area, was flattened, and everything on and around the airfields were flattened.
By December, you've got over 1,000 air raids mounted by aircraft which are fast enough and maneuverable enough to elude ground defenses and shake up ground fire. The German Dornier, Heinkel, and Junkers 88, they call them medium bombers, we call them light medium bombers, are fast, maneuverable, take punishment well. And so it becomes harder and harder to bring them down. And a Malta anti-aircraft defense that depends heavily on local volunteers is beginning to wonder, well, what's it take to get these guys?
December 1941. The 1,000 Axis raids on Malta has not brought the island any closer to a surrender. Only 15 miles long, Malta becomes the most heavily bombed target in the world.
The Germans in particular would bomb around the clock or as near to it as makes no difference, the nights of the full moon. And that could mean doing as many as 6 sorties a day. That is, taking off and landing. The norm was rather 2 a day, because the bases in Italy and Sicily were a good long way away, and it was a fairly demanding flight. It did put very high physical and psychological strains on the crew. German air crew who flew the Malta runs would say that you could hear the engines hammering long after you got out of the plane back at your home base, that your body would be twitching to the rhythms of the plane when you try to lie down and sleep. This took a toll of physical and emotional health, but above all, it was the sense of having to go back day after day after day and do the same thing. This was a good way to go mad, particularly because, unlike the American system, the Germans did not allow for relieving crews and pilots after a certain number of missions. Psychologically, they're poorly equipped for the kind of war of attrition that increasingly, with nobody really liking the idea, becomes the norm over Malta.
On April 17, 1942, the embattled island of Malta wins a decoration for bravery. King George VI awards the island the Order of the George Cross. But the award ceremony is cut short by the arrival of yet another Axis bombing.
The George Cross is one of the rarest medals in the world, and it was outstanding feats of valor when you were not in the services. Now, King George has always been very interested in Malta, and when he heard that the island was being subjected to so much bombing and privation, he had the very bright idea of giving a special George Cross to the island. And it's the only case, I think, of a medal being given to a piece of territory rather than to an individual.
There are now only 8 British aircraft operating against some 15 Axis squadrons. Malta desperately needs fighter planes to regain control of its airspace. There is not a single British aircraft carrier available for the urgent mission. English Prime Minister Winston Churchill makes a desperate appeal to the United States. Will the response be in time to save Malta? In April 1942, the American carrier Wasp brings British Spitfires into the Mediterranean.
The only way of getting the fighters to Malta was to put them on board an aircraft carrier and get the aircraft carrier within about 500 miles of Malta and then fly them off the decks.
As soon as the Spitfires arrive, German radar alerts the Axis air fleet at Sicily. The Luftwaffe strikes and destroys or disables every one of the planes. On the same day, British intelligence learns that an airborne invasion from Sicily is imminent. Meanwhile, German and Italian troops on Sicily are preparing for the airborne invasion of Malta. Hitler and Mussolini agree on a date for the Axis assault, early June. By now, Malta has been under steady aerial siege for 23 months. The British no longer have airplanes and very little ammunition left.
We had a limited number of anti-aircraft guns, and to the extent possible, it was very hard to get supplies to Malta at all. They were rationed to only fired bombers, not fighters.
The one resource which keeps the casualty rate low is the island's excellent shelters. Since Malta is made of limestone, the caverns provide protection for the Maltese.
The rock is very soft, and there were a great number of shelters, and they made a great number more. the Maltese took it remarkably well. They took it just the way that the Londoners took it. And they just put up with every privation with a shrug of the shoulders and said, we'll carry on. But basically, the bombing turned the whole thing round. Any thought of giving in after they've been bombed, well, same as happened in London. Any thought of giving in after you've bombed, you don't give in. Bombing has a reverse effect.
In early May 1942, the USS Wasp and the British carrier Eagle return and successfully deliver a replacement squadron of 64 Spitfires within flying range of Malta.
But this time, we'd learned from the errors the first time. The first lot all landed at Takali, which is the fighter airfield, and they were very largely written off on the ground. This time they split them between the three airfields. It made sense. And they had them all in the air in about 15 minutes after arriving.
The Spitfires are refueled and airborne in minutes as German bombers approach. They meet the Junkers and Messerschmitts head-on over the airfield. The Luftwaffe gets more than it bargains for. 37 German planes are lost. The British only lose 3.
This second operation is the turning point of the air campaign because they achieve a victory by blowing away the first 47. Now, here are 60-odd more. And the Luftwaffe pilots and their commanders are beginning to think, what do the Armies and Brits do? You know, pull them out of hats?
British intelligence learns that Axis troops scheduled to invade Malta have been diverted to the Panzer Army in North Africa. The invasion of Malta will not take place. Malta continues to be dependent on the outside world for such things as grain, meat, and gasoline. The Germans commence starvation tactics.
When it becomes apparent that the Italian Air Force can't establish superiority, the Army says, we're not going to risk a parachute division on a suicide mission, and the Navy says, we can't cover an amphibious landing. So the Germans continue what amounts to an attritional campaign of wearing Malta down by starvation.
In June, British convoys attempt to reach the island from both Gibraltar and Alexandria. Of 115 Allied vessels, only 2 get through.
Until German planes committed to Malta are required elsewhere on the Russian front in the Western Desert, they continue an increasingly futile pattern of bombing an island that most historians agree was not that important.
The rationing of supplies takes its toll as morale sinks. Community kitchens barely feed a fraction of the population.
I seem to remember the price of an egg. In those days, a black market egg was up to about 3 shillings, which is equivalent to about 10 pounds today or something.
The situation in Malta is becoming critical if supply ships are unable to break through the Axis obstacles. Unknown to the Maltese or the British forces on the island, the English government is unable to agree on whether to defend Malta or surrender.
The War Cabinet was prepared to give up Malta, apart from Churchill. On paper, the island was completely undefendable. You can actually see Sicily on a fine day.
Building on Churchill's stubbornness, one final convoy carrying the last hope of relief for Malta leaves England. 14 merchant ships carrying over 120,000 tons of supplies are escorted by 4 aircraft carriers, 40 destroyers, 2 battleships, and 12 cruisers. But the reinforced convoy is too big to conceal from the Germans. August 10th, Malta's Savior fleet enters the Mediterranean. Converging against it, a powerful German-Italian force, spearheaded by 21 submarines and 540 aircraft. August 12th, the Axis air attack hits in full force. British carrier planes and concentrated ack-ack fire again keep the attackers away from the merchant ships. But finally, 40 Stuka bombers go into a power dive through the barrage. By evening, both fleet and convoy reach a narrow channel to the harbor where protective battleships and carriers cannot follow because of limited sea room. The merchant ships must try to squeeze into the port with only a skeleton escort. The Germans seize the last opportunity to attack. Torpedoes hit their mark and take a toll on the convoy. Five bombed merchant ships limp into the harbor at Malta. They bring food, but no gasoline. The tanker Ohio, an American ship with an all-British crew, carries the gasoline that's Malta's sole hope for survival. Heavily damaged, the slowly sinking tanker staggers into harbor with its precious cargo. Malta has survived its darkest hour. After the operations at Malta, Tony Spooner would be a flight instructor and later serve as a coastal command officer in the invasions on D-Day.
What Malta did, almost 80% by our submarines in Malta, we sank and damaged enough supply ships to keep Rommel short of fuel in particular and of everything else, because like us, he had to have everything brought in. Even dimly at the time, I think we all realized the significance of Malta, some more than others. But I'm quite certain in my own mind I could never have been Alamein without Malta.
The rocky island of Malta proves to be the most important factor for British victory in North Africa, hastening defeat for the Germans and making the Mediterranean a British patrolled territory.